And we'll begin the formal part of the event with acknowledgement of the country. So in the spirit of reconciliation, the Cecil Society Australia acknowledges the traditional custodian of country for Australia and the connection to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to the elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today. And it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers, Dr. Gabriela Nodari of the Reserve Bank Australia. I have to say that this talk has been planned a long time ago. I think it's almost like 1.5 years coming. And so it's actually a pleasure to have Gabriela here tonight with us. And Gabriela is a senior economist at the RBA. Gabriela has a PhD in economics from the University of Verona in Italy. And prior to joining RBA, she spent some time as a postdoc at UNSW. She has been working in RBA since 2016 and worked in many different teams, including macroeconomics modeling, overseas economics, and more recently, price, wages, and the labor market. So Gabriela research focused on the empirical analysis of business cycle, non-linearities of microeconomics, shocks, and related stabilization policies. And tonight, Gabriela will give a talk on COVID-19 and turnover in the Australian labor market. And Gabriela, the floor is yours.
Thanks for the nice introduction. And it is true, it has been a long time and since the first time we kind of talked and agreed to do a talk. In the meantime, I have moved the teams in the RBA. I have changed the research topics a few times. And so, yeah, today I'm presenting on turnover in the labor market, in the Australian labor market. So basically, this is some work I have been doing with a colleague of mine at the RBA, Emma Chow. And it's basically an analysis of turnover and job mobility within the Australian labor market. Now, let me kind of set the expectations there. We are not doing any kind of fancy techniques or anything. This is just a preliminary analysis that we have done to establish some stylized facts. And so I'm going to show you a couple of charts, a few things, but basically, yeah, the idea of this work is we are hoping to turn this into a bulletin article at the RBA sometime early next year. And so usually the audience of our bulletin articles is not so much economists or people with technical background. And so we try to kind of keep the analysis as simple as we can. Okay, so let me start with a bit of motivation of why we are we are interested in turnover in the labor market. So basically, the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted labor markets globally, not only in Australia. We had millions of people around the world who have been stood down or lost their jobs, and others rapidly adjusted to working from home as social distancing and mobility restrictions were introduced. Now, on the one hand, the pandemic accelerated existing trends in remote work, e-commerce, and automation, and this may have a lasting impact on the composition of labor demand in the mix of occupations and skills required in a post-pandemic labor market. On the other hand, the pandemic has also provided opportunity for workers to reflect on their work-life balance, their jobs, and whether their skills are being put to good use. And so as a result, an increasing number of employees seem to be considering or have recently already quit their jobs. And this has been especially the case in the United States. So as you can see in the chart here, the quit rate, which basically measures voluntary resignations as a share of employment, reached a record high of almost 3% in August, with almost 4.3 million American workers quitting their jobs in a single month. And then around 20% of these workers were employed in the leisure and hospitality industry. And this exodus of workers has been basically called the Great Resignation. So basically what we want to do here is to check whether we are seeing the same kind of phenomenon taking place in Australia. And if so, what are the reasons that could be driving turnover in the labor market? And if this is a big enough phenomenon that could drive some sectoral reallocations or structural changes in the structure of the labor market across industries. And then I'm also going to touch a little bit on the implications that turnover may have for the broader economy. Okay, so just before I go into the more details, just on the data that we use, we basically use ABS microdata from the longitudinal labor force survey. So basically, this is a survey made by the ABS on a monthly basis. It surveys the Australian resident population aged 15 plus years old. The sample consists of approximately 50,000 individuals, and there are 8 subsamples, which are the rotations group, and each of them remains in the sample for 8 consecutive months. Now, even though this survey is made on a monthly basis, and that's what allows us to have the monthly statistics of employment, unemployment, and so on, the more detailed questions about industry changes or the details of these questions are made only every 3 months. And so we have our analysis is based on a quarterly basis because we don't have the monthly series. And to give you a sense of the questions that we look at, for example, in this survey, one of the most relevant questions for us is whether, so there is a question that asks respondents whether they have been in their current job or with their current employer for more or less than 12 months. And so if they have been with the current employer for less than 12 months, then this survey asks for how many months they have been there, and if it's for more, for how many years. So this is what allows us to kind of see the transitions across different industries or different jobs in the labor market. Okay, so basically we start by looking broadly at resignations rather than pure job-to-job transitions. And basically what we see here, we calculate the job separation rate, which is just statistics that tells you how many people have quit their jobs, left or lost their jobs for different reasons. We can separate the job separation rate by voluntary and involuntary reasons. Now, prior to the pandemic, around 3.5% of employed people in Australia on average voluntarily quit their jobs on a quarterly basis. In contrast, only around 2% were likely to involuntarily lose their jobs in any given quarter. Now, when the pandemic first hit in early 2020, the rate of involuntary job separations spiked above 5%. And this is basically consistent with what we have seen with employment. So in the 3 months to May 2020, at the worst of the pandemic, basically, aggregate employment fell by over 6.5%. And so most of those losses were involuntary job losses. These job losses have been concentrated in contact-intensive industries such as arts and recreation and the hospitality industries. Now, as the economic recovery progressed, the number of involuntary job separations rapidly declined, as we can see in the orange line there, although it has ticked up a little bit following the Delta outbreak in June 2021, but of course not to the same extent that we have seen in the mid of last year. Conversely, the number of people leaving their jobs for voluntary reasons has increased since late 2020, with the most common reason being to seek a better job or simply because employees want that change. Now, part of this pickup in voluntary job separations is likely to comprise of pent-up demand by workers who delayed job changes over the past year in face of heightened uncertainty around the economy. The increase in voluntary job separations is also consistent with the positive outlook for the labor market, as workers tend to be more willing to bear the costs and risks of changing jobs when there are more opportunities and strong labor demand out there. Now, the higher quit rates may also indicate that the pandemic led more workers to reevaluate their careers and work-life balance. And so for workers in contact-intensive roles, these may involve seeking jobs with greater stability, where in industries that are not so sensitive to lockdowns and there is more remote work available and so on. Now, to kind of understand where these workers are moving to, we basically take a step further and look at job mobility. So we define job mobility in this analysis as people who switched jobs as a share of the total continuous employment. So basically, we are looking at people who had a job 3 months ago and moved to a new job this quarter as a share of all the people who were employed in both the current month and 3 months ago. So this kind of ensures us that these people it's kind of voluntary turnover because they are very unlikely to move to unemployment. And so this is likely to be voluntary changes in job turnover. And basically what we see here with this job mobility rate is that there was a sharp drop at the onset of the pandemic, but then the job mobility rate quickly rebounded to record levels in the past, to 3.5%, which is basically a record level over the past decade. So another thing that we notice is that despite the recent lockdowns since June, from June to October, job mobility increased further even in these 3 months. So then we ask, okay, where are these people moving to? Are these people just changing jobs and remaining in the same industry, or are they actually, is there a migration of workers outside of industries that were more impacted by the pandemic and so on? So what we do is basically to look at the job mobility rate within industries and across industries. So we look at people who moved the jobs but remained in the same industry, and people who moved the jobs and moved to another industry. So looking at the time series, job mobility across industries has been slightly higher than within industries in the past. And that at first may seem a bit counterintuitive because you would think that if you change industry, you are kind of changing occupation, but actually there are many occupations where you can change industry but still remain doing the same job that you do. You just think about managers, for example, they can change lots of industries without changing the nature of job that they do. Now, both types of mobility fell during the pandemic, but then both of them rebounded as well. And so on aggregate, there is no evidence that there have been significant employment reallocation across industries by looking at this data, because both types of mobility picked up and none of them seem to be incredibly higher with respect to the past. So with our data, we cannot calculate a job mobility rate by industry because of sample size issues. In some industries, our sample size is too small, and so we wouldn't get the data cleared by the ABS to kind of publish or show these statistics externally. But what we can do, though, is to look at aggregate flows of employment. So we are looking at all the people who were employed in a given industry and 3 months later moved to another industry. So it's a little bit different from the job mobility because these people are likely to transition to unemployment as well and then come back to the industry in these 3 months. So it's picking up a larger share of people. So we look at outflows from a given industry to different industries, and also inflows from other industries to a given industry. We cannot, again, map exactly, we cannot decompose where workers go, but just look at the aggregate flows. And what we see here is basically that more workers, even though we don't find a strong evidence of prevalently across industries mobility, we find that in some industries, and in particular administrative and support services, arts and recreation, and hospitality, more workers are moving out of these industries. And so the likely motivation here is that, as I mentioned before, these industries are more exposed to lockdowns, people are finding uncertain employment conditions, and basically more likely to look for more stable forms of employment. This is kind of a bit confirmed by information that we get from our liaison program. So every month, people from the RBA meet with a lot of businesses out there and ask a number of questions. So we have kind of timely information. And we have been seeing from these liaisons that, for example, people in the tourism industry are very likely to kind of move to industries that are a bit more stable. On the other side, we also see that workers are being attracted to industries such as rental and real estate services and information media. And here we think that what is driving these inflows into these industries are basically favorable economic conditions. In the rental and real estate services, for example, the real estate sub-industry of this aggregate sector basically has experienced a large boom, as I'm sure you are aware, given all the incentives to housing construction and so on, and so more people are moving into this industry. And information media, what we think is basically that with higher demand for information technology, IT workers, and so on, people are being attracted to these industries. Now, despite we see these movements across workers in some of the industries, on aggregate, we don't see any evidence, at least to date, that these moves are inducing a structural change in the labor market. So in this chart here, what we are showing is basically industry employment shares pre-COVID, which is basically February 2020. And then we compare to the shares in May this year. And we could have done the data for August, but again, to kind of abstract from the effects of recent lockdowns, we just look at May, because from May to August, again, we have seen employment falls in hospitality, arts and recreation, and so on. So we look at what was happening just before the Delta outbreak. And as we can see there, the relative shares are not so different from what they were pre-pandemic. And so despite movements on the aggregate, it doesn't seem that we are having a revolution in the labor market. Now, what we do, though, we can calculate job mobility rates for sectors, because the sectors are a bit more aggregate. We have a bit more data in there, so we can have a sense of what's happening, at least by sector. And what we find here is basically that job mobility seems to be driven mostly by the business services sector. And if we disaggregate, if we look at workers moving to another sector or within the same sector, we can see that the prevalence is for people to remain in the business services sector. So mobility has increased in that sector and relative to the other two. And it is also high relative to pre-COVID levels of job mobility. Now, in the household services sector, which is the most affected by the pandemic, where it includes, for example, arts and recreation and hospitality, mobility has picked up, but in this sector, it's more likely that what's happening is just people returning to the labor market and changing employers. But so it's more a consequence of the uneven impact of the pandemic on employment rather than workers reevaluating their careers or work-life balance. Now, to dig a bit more into the business service sector, what we do is to look at job turnover by occupation as well. So again, this does not map into sectors directly, but we see that the professionals are the most likely to be changing jobs recently, and more general white-collar workers are the more likely to be changing their jobs. And then I'm not showing the chart here, but we also see that turnover is high for high-skilled and mid-career workers. So altogether, this is suggesting that the people who are driving part of the turnover in the labor market are professionals, people who are in mid-career, who have certain prospects, some stability already in the labor market. And so this is indicating to us that what's driving turnover is the strong demand in certain areas of the economy. And so people are more encouraged to change their jobs. Now, what are some of the implications of job mobility? Well, on the aggregate, basically, job mobility has, of course, oops, what did I do here? Give me a second. Okay. Can you still see that? Thank you. I'm going to take that. You can see that.
Yes.
Okay. So what are some of the economic implications of job mobility? Now, there are both benefits and costs associated with job mobility. So in the near term, workers switching jobs, for example, may experience disruptions due to the need to learn new job-specific skills. On the firm side, firms may suffer the loss of job-specific skills of workers that are leaving. They may also experience disruption in productions and incur the costs of hiring and training new workers. However, job mobility also allows workers to be potentially better matched with a suitable job that fits their preferences. And basically, they could change to occupations where they are more likely to be more productive. And for firms, incoming workers may be better educated, more skilled, and have greater initiative and enthusiasm to do their jobs than those who leave. And so this would imply an increase in labor productivity in the medium term. Now, another potential benefit is that high rates of voluntary job turnover, especially in a tight labor market, may provide employers the incentive to offer higher wages to retain their workers. And so job mobility and wage growth tend to be positively correlated. I mean, the correlation is not so high. This chart is just showing they tend to move in the same direction. But on aggregate, so there is still a fair amount of spare capacity in the labor market to be absorbed, but wages pressures could emerge as a result of turnover in these areas experiencing labor shortages. Okay, so basically to just summarize the findings that we have with this analysis, what we have seen so far, that voluntary job separations have increased a little bit, but this appears to reflect workers changing their jobs for better ones by taking advantage of tightening labor market. And it's not a great resignation phenomenon as the media is kind of framing it for the US or to some extent for Australia. Now, despite increased job mobility, there are no signs of structural changes in the labor market. But if persistent, this increase in job mobility could lead to increased labor productivity and higher wages growth. So that's all that I have for today. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Gabriela, for a very interesting talk about the summarizing what happened during the COVID-19 and the labor market. And please join me in thanking Gabriela for a very interesting talk.